Francis Suarez of Miami. So good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm well, Suzanne. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Of course, this is a critical time in our country. We are seeing a pandemic that really requires and calls for great leadership, for innovation, as well as moral clarity. At the same time, you have protests throughout the country on the streets calling for social and racial justice, as well as peace. I'll start off first by just asking how you were doing. I know that you were recovering from the coronavirus. How are you feeling?
I feel great. I was very lucky. I caught it very early. I happened to be in a room with someone very early on in early March that tested positive and went public with it. And I was in a few pictures with the person, probably shook the person's hand, and I probably, had conversations with the person. And so the Department of Health asked me to come in and get tested. I was completely asymptomatic. And thankfully, they caught it early so that I didn't transmit it to any member of my family or any member of my government, which was extremely stressful for me those first few days.
It's so good to see you and that you're well, and we'll come back to that
Sure.
discussion. But I want to talk about what's going on the streets, because we are seeing throughout the country thousands and thousands of people who are protesting, calling for racial and social justice after that video that we saw of African-American George Floyd being killed by the police officer. And it seems to me as if there is an inflection point in this country. What do you make of the groundswell of people who have taken to the streets and are demanding justice?
Well, I'm obviously horrified along with them of the images that we saw. It's inexcusable what that officer did. I'm glad that he was charged immediately, and I'm glad that the other three officers were charged. What's disturbing is not only his conduct, which was reprehensible and unforgivable, and he's going to face justice himself, but the fact that three other officers who, have a duty not only to protect the victim in this case, which was George Floyd, but also to protect their own integrity and to protect the integrity of their department and the officer who was clearly crossing the line. I think we handled, the protest in a way that got us national recognition in the city of Miami. Not one protester was hurt. We on Saturday didn't confront the protesters with riot gear. So we let them, and we actually helped them and gave them access to our streets so that they can protest peacefully, and by and large they did. Obviously we had people that wanted to loot and damage things, and we had to unfortunately confront those people who were not there to add to the message, that were there to detract from the message and to create chaos and division.
And this is a systemic problem when you talk about police brutality. So in your community, in your city, how do you address that? And President Obama says take a pledge, and pledge to, sign his pledge for police reform, for taking back a step when it comes to use of force.
The fact that the president, asked for us to make that pledge, frankly, is something we should have always been doing. And it's something that we always need to do. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a one-time pledge. This is a moral obligation that we have. This is a continual pledge that we make. And the pledge is not really just only in policing, but certainly now the focus is on policing. It's a pledge to always do better. It's always to look within ourselves. It's always to be self-critical. It's always to be reflective of what's going on in the community and the history that has led us here. Miami, the history hasn't always been pretty when it comes to racial disturbances, police-involved actions, and we need to be honest about that. And I think, frankly, some of the reasons why Miami, I think, outperformed a lot of the cities across the country is because we confronted our issues.
I assume that you are on board with President Obama's pledge. I want to talk about that history a little bit, because it was really quite stunning what we heard from President Trump when he had said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And as you know, that comes from Miami's history. The former police chief, Walter Headley, who used that in 1967 really to justify police brutality against those who were out there protesting for racial equality and to put people down.
Yeah, I think any message like that is incendiary. It's inflammatory. Like I was telling you before we got on the air, we specifically on Saturday had sort of a strategy that we did not want to display overt aggression during the protest. And I think that helped tremendously in keeping things calm in Miami on Saturday, and on Sunday was flawless. Saturday was nearly flawless. But I think part of it was we said, look, we want to let the protesters protest. They have a right. They have a reason, a very good reason. And we don't, and by the way, the reason is not related to things that don't have to do with police. They're precisely because of police. So the last thing we want to do is be antagonistic. And so we try to do everything that we could do not to be antagonistic. So for me, I think it has to be, I know we're going to talk about this probably later, but, in terms of the Rodel program and the Aspen Institute, I remember fondly reading one of the letters of Martin Luther King, where he talks about, having white pastors and members of the white evangelical community come out and condemn racism. And so I think, for me, the language has to be a language of peace, a language of love, a language of unity, a language of understanding. And things that are inflammatory don't meet that definition. They don't reduce tensions. They don't create empathy. And so that's a major concern.
And Mayor, I know one of the lessons learned in the Rodel Fellowship that we've all studied is really about peaceful protest and how one uses one's leadership, how they wield power. We saw peaceful protesters, the use of the government, of the military force to clear out Lafayette Park so that the president could go and do a photo op at a church. What does that say about values and leadership today on the federal level?
Well, I can tell you that, there's examples throughout the country of tear gas, the use of tear gas being something that's provocatory, antagonistic, and that created a lot of the very things that we wanted to avoid. I can tell you on Saturday, unfortunately, we deployed some tear gas. We did that because we made some mistakes, really, that we could have avoided, and we did avoid on Sunday, and therefore on Sunday we didn't have to use any tear gas.
What mistakes? Can you tell us lessons learned?
Sure. But let me just give you one statistic that's interesting. The day we used tear gas, which was Saturday, we had 57 arrests between the city and the county. The day we didn't use tear gas, which was Sunday, we had 3 arrests. So I think that right there encapsulates the aggressive response to something as aggressive as tear gas. It's just inflammatory. But what are the lessons learned for us? One of them was, look, when people are protesting, to some extent, you do have to take away symbols, because what happens is, and in that case, we deployed tear gas because we had 2 police cars that were exposed, and we didn't want them to become symbols of some sort of chaotic environment. And we wanted to make sure that, no one got hurt in terms of the destruction of those vehicles. And so we had to get the vehicles out of there, and we had to clear the area. Probably hindsight being 2020, we could have potentially used a different method, but we struggled with it. I can tell you, I was in the command center, and we literally struggled for 45 minutes to try to find the least, antagonistic way, the least aggressive way to accomplish our goal. Rather than have police in riot gear en masse, we use these bicycle police officers, which were very effective.
Okay.
And they were able to build barriers without having riot gear, without having tear gas, without having any of those things. And we also implemented a curfew, and the curfew was very effective. We messaged it throughout the day. We got community leaders, members from the African American community, members from all communities, really, to come out and reemphasize the fact that we want people to protest. We want to give them as much
right
to protest, but at some point, when the night falls, we expect people to go home.
And Mayor, let's talk about the coronavirus, because it really was an extraordinary situation in the beginning. You had the governor who seemed quite lax in restrictions, and you, in your leadership, you were one of the first really to cancel a major festival. You had restrictions in place, and there was a lot of perhaps even confusion, complication, because of the way things are governed. You have, you're in charge of the city, but not the beaches. You have a mayor of the beach, and then you have Miami-Dade, sure, and all of these different layers. How, in looking forward now, would you try to convince the governor and those who were opposing your restrictions to come on board sooner, because that was such a critical moment and inflection point in your own leadership?
Thank you. I was actually yesterday with Wolf Blitzer on a panel where we had the former Surgeon General of the U.S. under Obama, who was on the call, and we were talking about the decisions to cancel big events like Ultra and Cayocho, which would have congregated 400,000 people in a very, very small area, most likely save lives. And one of the things that the former Surgeon General was saying is the problem with these things is when you do your job, people will often look back and say, well, it was no big deal. And that's kind of the point. The point is that we didn't have more deaths. We didn't have more infections. Having said that, Miami still had the most infections of any city in Florida. And there's an obvious reason for that. We're the densest, largest, most populated city essentially in Florida. Jacksonville is slightly more populous, but it's a county city. So it doesn't,
Right.
Our county is about 3 million people. So it would be 3 times greater than Jacksonville. So, but for me, making those decisions, as you mentioned, those were turning points for me in terms of leadership. Those were moments of growth for me in terms of leadership. I had to listen to the experts, follow my gut, and ultimately make difficult decisions that I knew I was going to get criticized for, that I knew was going to have great fiscal impacts on people's lives, but that I also knew was going to save lives.
What did you learn personally about yourself going through this pandemic, and also having the virus, going through that virus?
Going through the virus really gave me a perspective. Most people were on what I call the other side, the determining whether they were sick, wondering whether they were going to get tested, how could they get tested, etc. I already was on the other side. I was already sick. I was already infected. So to me, it gave me a sense for how easily an asymptomatic carrier could spread the disease, because I was an asymptomatic carrier, and had I not been tested early, I would have potentially spread it to many, many people. It helped me mature as a leader because I realized that I was leading under extremely adverse circumstances. I decided to do a journal, which I think gave people a lot of peace and comfort, because they could see someone who was walking this journey of being infected. And it gave people a sense of comfort that maybe if they get it, they'll be in the 50 to 80% of people that have mild symptoms to being asymptomatic, which I think really reduced the tension and the stress for people. Obviously, being away from my 2 children and my wife for 18 days was incredibly difficult. I've never been away from them that long. I've never been able not to touch them for that long. And I think that's something that sometimes in life, we take some things for granted.
And you mentioned the Rodel Fellowship, but tell me a little bit about, you are in the middle of that. What kinds of things are you thinking about in terms of your own personal transformation, your growth, your leadership style, when you take away some of those teachings and those readings?
So many of the readings I'm thinking about them right now, they're so relevant, even though many of them were written so long ago, they're so relevant to leading in a modern day time. I think the second part is the network of people. I mean, I'm in that my class I have Melvin Carter, who's from St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota. St. Paul, Minnesota. I have London Breed, who I was leaning on a lot, from San Francisco during the COVID crisis. We were sharing orders, back and forth, and you get a sense for a nonpartisan or a bipartisan way of looking at solutions. I think I firmly believe sometimes that the partisan dichotomy is kind of a little bit of a false dichotomy. Very few times in life are we all the way one way or all the way another way, or there's not one fact about you that if I knew it, it would determine how you think about everything else.
Right.
Not your gender, not your background, not your faith. So I to me, it's a little bit uncomfortable at times. But I think Rodel gets you out of all those constructs, out of those things that box you in.
Mayor, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Best of luck to you, and continue to be well. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too.